Carlow, Ireland, with the equivalent of a master's degree in divinity. Later, he was graduated from Fordham University with a master's degree in religious education, and later a doctorate in education from Union Theological Seminary, Columbia Teachers College. Indeed, it is there at Union Theological, that great center of learning across the street from Columbia, where he had the awesome experience of learning from the likes of the Dominican theologian Gutierrez and the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire. Professor Groom's primary area of interest and research is the history, theory, and practice of religious education, putting forward a method known as shared Christian practice. Among his noted books are Educating for Life, A Spiritual Vision for Every Teacher and Parent, a book that reflects the way he teaches, full of stories, examples, and good questions. His most recent tome, not including a textbook series, is What Makes Us Catholic: 8 Gifts for Life. Other texts include Christian Religious Education, Sharing Our Story and Vision, a published Language for a Catholic Church, a pastoral manual on inclusive language, and Sharing Faith, a comprehensive approach to religious education and pastoral ministry, which received third place in the Catholic Press Association Awards in 1992. More, he wrote the preface to John Baptist de La Salle, The Spirituality of Christian Education, which is part of the Parlous Press Spirituality series. Born in County Kildare, Ireland, Thomas Groom, as he prepares to come forward, offers us this learned thought. One mark of a great educator is the ability to lead students out to new places where even the educator has never been. Professor Thomas Groom.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ernest. I should bring Ernest on the road with me. That was a marvelous introduction. I wanted to turn around and look behind me to see who was he talking about, because you feel a little exaggerated. And thank you, Ernest, and thank you, Brother Dennis. And I feel like a guest, an honored guest at a family gathering. So thank you for inviting me. I'm a little daunted by the task now that I sit there listening to the momentous historic occasion that this is definitely going to become. And the fact that you have me for 3 sessions, I probably should have prepared better for this. But anyhow, I'm going to give you what we have. But really, it's wonderful that you're gathering this way. I just want to reiterate what Ernest and Brother and Dennis have said. I mean, this charism of the catechesis and evangelization was the original raison d'etre for the De La Salle brothers. And Saint La Salle, that was his purpose. So that to give it this kind of central function within the ministry, great ministry that you do in your schools, is simply imperative. And to call it the Luke Psalm gathering or event or conference is so appropriate, because nobody took it more seriously than Luke Psalm did. He was a wonderful catechist, a tremendous theologian, and never saw any tension between that. He was a great, renowned theologian, past president of the Catholic Theological Society of America, and yet I heard him many times introduce himself as a catechist, which most theologians don't do, in case you hadn't noticed. They don't think of themselves as catechists, but he saw himself, even in the midst of his great scholarship, as a great catechist. I worked closely with Luke only on one occasion, and that was for Brother George Van Grieken's doctoral dissertation. He was the first LaSallian that I worked with doing a dissertation on De La Salle and the charism. I learned a little from that, which is why I had the gumption to write the preface to the collection of essays. But I knew very little about La Salle at the time. I was a young professor at Boston College. Brother George Van Grieken, he's out in California. And I did direct Brother John Crawford as well. But anyway, at that time, I was very lacking in confidence in knowing the Lasallian charism. It's a very sophisticated scholarly literature. So I said to George, we really should put a Lasallian scholar on your dissertation, because otherwise, what credibility does it have within Lasallian scholarship? So I said, well, Luke Psalm is an obvious one. So I didn't know Luke very well. But when I put the question to our EPC, the Education Policy Committee, who appoints the official doctoral dissertation committee, they were a little bit skeptical. You know, would he be rigorous? You know, he's a Lassallean. Well, you know, he said, will he be kind of a little too fair? Well, anyway, by the time it was all over, I had to call off Luke because he beat the tar out of my poor friend, George Van Grieken. He was so demanding and so, oh, my goodness me. So it was a good scholarship by the time Luke got through with it, I'll tell you that. No thanks to me. But thank you for inviting me. And thank you. Ernest was the one who wrote. And I learned years ago it can be important to establish who exactly invited me. True story. I was invited back to Ireland to do a workshop with the priests of my home diocese. I'd finished up a dissertation at Columbia Union, and they said, "Well, come home, Tom. You know, all is forgiven, and we'll have a." It was going to be a clergy conference, a clergy study day. So I went off to do it, and it was 1977, 78. And we were in the afterglow still of the great Second Vatican Council and the spirit of it, and I was very enthused about it, still am actually. And but they weren't. They were not because they had explored it, but because they hadn't gotten there yet. They weren't quite. These people weren't. They were ready to say the rosary may be facing the people, but not the mass. So, but I was trying to convince them that basically that the Holy Spirit would do a better job in the future of the church than the Holy Ghost did in the past, so that the Holy Spirit was really going to be a better way to go. So as the first session went on, I could see the arms folding and people beginning to talk to their neighbor and grumble, and you could tell by the body language that I was losing them rapidly. So, but there was one older priest in the front row who did smile a few times, and actually when I ended my first session looked as if he was going to applaud, but then he realized he was the only one, so he put his hands back in his pockets. So, but as they strutted out mumbling and grumbling, I knew I'd lost them, so I went over to this older priest and I said, "Father, I'm in trouble, right?" He said, "You are." I said, "It's not going well, is it?" "No, it isn't." I said, "God, it's not that bad, is it?" Tom, he says, "I don't blame you at all. I blame the people who invited you." So if it goes well, great, but if not, Luke or Ernest is the one who invited me. So that's how I've come to realize that it's important to identify that. Now, I'm going to try to be gentle with ourselves because many of you have traveled great distances and journeys and so on. So we'll make this a more meditative kind of event. To teach as Jesus did. What a pious, lovely, sanctimonious thought. We'll say more about it in a little while, but handing on the faith in the 21st century. Like this brother that decided to go teach advanced AP physics, it is a tremendously challenging time for handing on the faith. And I don't need to belabor this to you at all. By the way, all of the overheads I will use, we'll give them to you at the end of each session, if you stay. You'll get it. So you don't, if you're taking notes, take your own notes. Don't take mine. This is an interesting text. It's in Luke, and only in Luke. And it's at the end of his public life, public ministry rather. Because Luke 19 is the entry into Jerusalem. And he has a ministry that continues in Jerusalem. But basically, his ministry from beginning in Galilee is ending, and he's making his way into Jerusalem. And it's a throwaway line, or it looks like it, because there's nothing in the previous text or the subsequent text that really connects at all. Where he says, when the Son of Man comes again, and that was Jesus' favorite title for himself, in all four Gospels he refers to, so it's probably historically accurate that he actually did call himself by this title. Great debate about what it means. It's now better translated. Actually, it doesn't mean son. The original Greek does not mean son in the gender sense and does not mean man. It would be better translated as when the human one comes again, will he find faith on earth? And I just recently wrote a book and sent it off to a publisher. I'm not advertising it, but I called it Will There Be Faith? Is the title of the book. And I got this objecting email from somebody who heard the title and said, how could you even raise such a question? You know, will there be faith? I mean, of course there'll be faith. I mean, Jesus himself promised that I'll be with you always until the end of time. And they were quite irate at me. And I wrote back and I said, well, actually, it wasn't my question. Originally, it was Jesus of Nazareth that raised the question. Will there be faith? Will it take? Will it last? Will it sustain? And there's lots of reasons to wonder. Nor can we take the answer for granted. I mean, there are huge areas of this world that once was a vibrant Christian community that are no longer so. North Africa, for example. The French church that gave rise to the great Lassallean charism will have to be re-evangelized sometime. So I say yes, there will be faith, but so much depends. on how we teach it, why we teach it, what we want it to do in people's lives. As Dennis was saying, do we want to simply inform their heads, or do we want to form their hearts? Do we want to transform their very being in the world, set them on the road of lifelong conversion? So much depends on how we teach it, why we teach it, what we teach, how we represent this faith. Because we can make it sound like the most god-awful bunch of malarkey, or we can make it great, extraordinary. This religion of ours can mess up people's lives. It's so badly that 20 years of psychoanalysis will never undo the damage. Or it can be an extraordinary basis upon which to live life humanly and spiritually and religiously and Christianingly that we call Catholicism. And so much depends on how we represent it, what we represent it, where, the kind of environments, the kind of contexts, the kind of schools that we muster in order to represent it. I've been reading this fellow Charles Taylor. I'm going to say something very briefly. We're lovely to say that we're living in a very secular age, and that's kind of now a commonplace comment. Taylor outlines three different meanings of secularity. One is a falling off of religious practice, and that's happened, is happening in various different ways in different contexts. I was staying over dinner in my own native land. There are parishes in Dublin that have gone from attendance at Mass of 80, 84, 85% to 12% in the space of about 10 years, which even from the point of view of sociology is phenomenal. The sociologists don't know how to explain it. How there could be such a turnaround so quickly. So one is the falling off of religious practice. Another one is the banning of religion from the public square. And then a third one, which is the one I want to say a few words about, is that the social conditions of society now discourage faith. Because you can see some of these have positive. So especially the second one, that the separation the banning of religion from the public square, the separating out of religious and civil authority. So there's a certain secularity that's actually a great achievement. So when the Prime Minister of Turkey stands up in the Turkish Parliament, as he did recently, and said Turkey will remain a secular society, everybody gives a sigh of relief. Because it means that it's not going to become a theocracy. And so there's a great positive. When Benedict XVI was here on his pastoral visit a couple of years ago, he complimented the great American experiment because we have managed to separate the civil authority from the religious authorities in ways that many European countries still do not do, and certainly other parts of the world as well do it even less effectively. So there's a benefit and a blessing in secularity. But the one that is very difficult is when you have conditions that make it contrary to faith. And Taylor does this analysis where he takes the year 1500 and the year 2000 just to be safe. But in the year 1500, it was impossible not to be a person of faith. Atheism was not an option, at least not for ordinary people. Maybe for some rare elites, atheism was an option. But the whole culture, the whole society required you to believe. There was no option but faith. And in fact, there was pressure because if the crops failed and there was somebody in the village that wasn't going to Mass faithfully, they could easily get blamed for it. That's why the crops failed or whatever it was. My own village, my own Irish village, was very much of that kind of social, cultural condition. But what has happened now is that the conditions have almost reversed. It's now inimical to faith. It's now discouraging of faith. Because now we can, on all of the rationale or the bases that the people of the 1500s had for faith are now gone. So, and he outlines three. He says, well, the world of the time was an enchanted world. It was full of good magic and bad magic. And the bad magic was very dangerous, very threatening. Witches and werewolves and goblins and banshees and devils and all the rest of it. Were very real to people, and therefore, if you have bad magic, you better blooming well have good magic to offset them. And so Eucharist and saints and novenas and all kinds of things would offset the bad magic. But now, as my little boy Teddy, I have a little son of almost 10, and isn't it amazing how 41 people can decide immediately that I got a late start in parenting without ever talking to each other? Abraham is now my favorite, my patron saint. But he says, but Teddy's going to dress up as a werewolf or a banshee or something for Halloween. So devils and witches and all this kind of stuff is now stuff the kids play around with at Halloween. So we don't think it's real. But if you begin to get rid of the bad magic, do you also begin to get rid of the good magic? Another one he takes is our amazement, our awe at nature. So nature is still tremendously awesome to many people, but to many others, hey, it can be explained, you know. Pray for good weather, thank God for a nice day. No, it's the meteorologist will explain it to you at nighttime. It's a trough of low or high pressure that came in from Canada or came up from Texas, and we can explain it. We're in charge. And so on. So that the conditions for faith in our world have shifted to be, in a sense, antagonistic toward faith. There was a whole Enlightenment bias that ran through the whole Enlightenment movement of Descartes and Kant, and then leading on to the great critics, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and so on, that had the attitude that, hey, if you're an intelligent person and get a bit of education, you know what? You'll give up on that old superstition of your grandparents, that we mean religion or faith. So we're in a tough, and lots of these people come through your doors every day. That's probably a real incarnation in many ways of what Taylor is talking about. But you could take it then that, hey, there's very little hope for us, really. Where will we go from here, kind of thing. But I prefer to take the very opposite posture, and I was inspired by Cardinal Lustager, the former Cardinal Archbishop of Paris, wonderful man, and he says, but you know, this is the real time now for Christian faith. This is the opportune time. This is when it could make most sense in people's lives, because there's a dreadful banality to the secularity of our society and of our world, that life becomes banal. The ordinary and the everyday becomes banal, without meaning, without the spiritual, without the faith basis. Our morality becomes very, very unstable. There's nothing more banal than if you go to a religious service sometime, or not a religious service, go to an irreligious, a non-religious wedding. I was at one 2 weekends ago, and the young people getting married had chosen this to do it with a justice of the peace. And the text, I came away, and other people didn't know what was wrong with them at the wedding, but they knew that this couldn't be right, because this high point, this great celebration of love of these two people, but there was never a mention of God, there was never a mention of love, there was never a mention of real values, the spiritual was totally banned, and as a result, the whole thing was just downright banal. You know, I promise to respect you, and me as me, and together we will become a we. And you want to say, oh, come on. We're capable of more than this. So that there's a dreadful secularity, a negative secularity and banality that can only be offset by a faith perspective, by an embrace of the spiritual. So in a sense, but it does drive us to imagination. We do have to imagine new ways of going about it. And the same old modus operandi probably will not fit the bill. I think we have to go to the imagination. He said himself that every scribe learned in the reign of God is like the head of a household who can take from the storeroom. Some translations have the treasury, both the new and the old. So sure there'll be old ways and old patterns that we may bring with us, but we'll also have to imagine new possibilities. I always love his conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well, and the great promise he made her, and of course made to Christians ever after, of living waters. And one translation has waters that are gushing up, always fresh, always alive, always life-giving, not putrid, stagnant. And there are people in our church who can make it sound as if, hey, this whole thing should be stagnant and should be, but then stagnant water kills. It doesn't do anything. It eventually becomes putrid and dangerous to anything, fish, people, fauna or flora, gushing up to eternal life. So the old imaginations will have to go to work. So let me invite yours to go to work. Take your pen or paper, if you have a piece of paper handy, or borrow from a neighbor, or if you need if anyone forgot their folder, I can give you a lend of mine. Let me just, because I'm going to engage you regularly in the conversation as we ramble through these times together. What do you see as the primary challenges to handing on faith in the U.S. today? Thinking particularly of your students, your context, wherever it may be, university, high school, programs for delinquent youth, or whatever it might be. What do you see as some of the great challenges to handing on the faith in the U.S. today? And my friend and mentor, Paulo Freire, would say, don't be afraid to state the obvious. The obvious is very often what we need to see. But sometimes we don't see it because it's so obvious. So, what do you see as the great challenges? Take a note from yourself. On the other hand, what are some assets? What are some strategies that might help? Some hopes that you have? So think positively as well as the challenges. So the challenges and the hopes. Can I invite you, we'll do this fairly quickly, we'll do this many times throughout each of our sessions together. Turn to a neighbor for 2 or 3 minutes, see what the neighbor is thinking or feeling, or if they're drawing a blank, then volunteer your own comments. You know, don't hedge your bets. If you don't feel like talking to the neighbor, don't. But kind of listen to them. Listen, the neighbor always wants to say something. Have a chat with the neighbor. What are the big challenges? What are the big possibilities that you see for handing on this faith? Here, just a little great lively conversation. I hate breaking off good conversation, but on the other hand, we don't want to be late for Mass. We don't want to be late for Mass. So let me just bring you back together, and you will be with your neighbor again about 10 minutes from now, and about 10 minutes after that, and 10 minutes, well, maybe not that often, but let's hear a few of the sentiments that went around. What you see is the challenges, but also maybe the flip side, the hopes, the possibilities as well. Let's hear 3 or 4 voices coming around. Yourself, brother.
Yeah, one thing that we both came up with was, for one of the challenges, is unengaged parents.
Fair enough. Yeah. That's a common one. Yes, indeed. You were going to say.
This is a hope. Small groups getting together in somebody's house to study the Bible.
Fair enough.
Contact with a group that does that.
Yeah. And in a community context, in a home, perhaps. Thank you.
One of the books that's recently become my Bible as a campus minister is the study out of Duke University, Soul Searching, the Spiritual Life of American Teenagers.
Yes.
If you haven't read it yet, read it. Get a
Yeah.
copy. It's become my new Bible. It's
Yeah.
a comprehensive survey of the
Christian
spiritual life.
Smith, the author, yeah.
Christian Smith. And Catholic teenagers get a chapter all to themselves, but that's not good news.
Yeah.
Because they score the lowest
Yes.
of any teenage group, regardless of religious background, non-Christian and Christian both. And I wrote down 2 of the points that they made in terms of that, which has to do with the institutional church not giving either time or resources to the development of effective youth ministry programs.
Fair enough.
So
Fair enough.
They put some blame. They also mentioned unengaged parents, but they also put some blame.
Yeah,
It has to be the
yeah.
institutional church.
Yes, no, you can't say it otherwise. You have to call a spade a spade. I mean, and the Pew report actually confirmed Christian Smith's research that the mainline Christian community bleeding, they're all bleeding of their youth, but the one bleeding the most profusely is the Roman Catholic Church. And losing our youth at a level that no other mainline Christian communion is. So there's something awry with how we're going about it, and I like to blame the church. All in favor? I mean, but then Vatican II comes back to me and says, "Yeah, Tom, but you are the church." Or Dennis said it 4 or 5 times that we are the church. So you have to be, before you rush to judgment, you have to be careful.
Hope is service.
The hope is,
Kids love to serve.
and we're going
That's a way
of conversion. It's a way of conversion. It has extraordinary possibility. Yeah, we had a big incoming class into the School of Theology and Ministry at Boston College this year. Probably about 90 young people came in, which is about 85 of them are lay people. But when you go around and ask them, how did you get here? What brought you here? They'll all talk about their year in Haiti, or the year I spent in Nicaragua, or working in inner city Baltimore, the conversion experience in service is extraordinary, the potential of that. Yes, we'll talk about that. One or two other comments yourself, brother.
Left Catholic grammar school, because that's where the base was made. Other than the parents, they learned all the faith things in school, First Communion, all that. But less and less Catholic grammar schools is one of the bases.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. One more.
We talked about how the challenge can also be the strength in the sense that
Yes.
less and less like family structure and support, but that means that more of the responsibilities is sort of in the schools and up to us and the religious educators in the schools.
Fair enough. Great point. Let me push on. We'll hear from more people the next time around. I'm going to propose that we have to rethink the whole operation. Content-wise, pedagogically wise, contextually, etc. And I really will end up being somewhat practical by the end of the day tomorrow, by the end of my session tomorrow. But I'm going to try to lay some of the groundwork tonight. There's an amazing realization emerging in Catholic Christian faith, which is what CCF is for, is that the best asset we have, the best strategy, the best hope we have, the best thing we've got, is Jesus of Nazareth. Now that may sound a terribly obvious, ridiculous, patently, immediate thing to say, but there is a whole new awareness of the centrality of Jesus. And I'm going to be talking about enabling people to be converted to Jesus Christ as part of the foundation of what we do and how we go about it in campus ministry, religious education, or whatever. That it's not the Bible that's at the heart and center of our faith. It's not the church. And lots of Catholics think it is, including myself for a long time. I was raised to think it is. I was raised in a kind of church idolatry, as if the church is what we worship. But I always tell my students at Boston College, don't put your faith in the church. If you do, you'll probably lose it. Put your faith in God, in Jesus Christ, in this faith tradition, which is in no way to minimize the importance of the church and the need all of us have for a community of faith and tradition and stories and rituals and sacraments, etc. But it's simply to say that you can't exaggerate it. And when we do exaggerate it, I think one of the reasons why the whole abuse scandal has been so painful for us Catholics is that we were so heavily invested in church and so heavily invested in this elite leadership that we thought would do it for us and do it instead of us at times, especially if we pay them a little or support them. Because who can live the whole gospel? Who can go the extra mile and love the enemy, etc.? Most of us can't. But maybe we can get a group that can. And we'll put them up there on that pedestal. But it was a dreadful disappointment to us. But maybe we overinvested. It's not the sacraments, cherished and central as they are to us. It's not the dogmas, the doctrines, the commandments. And you can make the list. Instead, and this is from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, at the heart of it all, at the heart of our faith, it's a lovely part of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we find a person. The person, now watch how it puts it, the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the only Son from the Father. Ernest, I'm just going to move the pumpkin before I kick. I've kicked the bucket, but I've never kicked the pumpkin, so I don't want to. See how it says it? That we need the person of Jesus of Nazareth, the only Son from the Father. Very good theology. In other words, we need the Jesus of history. We need that fellow who walked the roads of Galilee, inviting people, come follow me, who preached this radical love, this crazy idea of loving even enemies, who fed the hungry, cared for the needy, welcomed the marginalized, claimed to fulfill Isaiah 61, the most radical text of the Hebrew Scriptures, says Brueggemann. He came into that synagogue at Nazareth on a Sabbath day, and he searched for the text. The Greek verb there is heurisko, and it's typically translated, the New American Bible translated as, he found the text. Well, he didn't find it. He searched for it. That's why he found it. He found it because he searched for it. And then says, the Spirit of God is upon me to bring good news to the poor, liberty to captives, sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim God's year of Jubilee, that radical notion that you figure out what belongs to whom and you give it back. that comes out to us out of the Hebrew Scriptures. And then, of course, then sat down and gave the shortest sermon probably ever given in a Jewish synagogue or indeed at a Catholic church either. Today, this text is fulfilled in your hearing. So we need the Jesus of history, and claim to be the way, the truth, and the life. That he is the way, the truth, and the life, and demonstrated, lived it. So we need the Jesus of history, but we also need the Christ of faith. In other words, the only Son of God, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, who by his life, death, resurrection made it possible. He didn't simply model the way, he actually made it possible for people to follow the way. By God's abundant grace in Jesus Christ, as Paul wrote to Timothy, we can live as disciples. And so presenting young people with the reality of grace in their lives and the possibility of grace, indeed a call to discipleship to Jesus Christ, but then that it is possible. The General Directory for Catechesis says all preaching, all teaching should put people in communion, and this is the ultimate purpose of catechesis, says the General Directory for Catechesis. The ultimate purpose is to put people in communion and intimacy with Jesus Christ. And from my experience over the years, I work with college students, but I taught high school for at least 3 years, and have worked with young people. And the difference between a senior in high school and a first freshman at Boston College is 3 months. So, I deal with the seniors that come in to us from your great schools, or have for many years. Then they gave me a day job, and I don't get to teach undergrads anymore, unfortunately. I look forward to going back to teaching undergrads. But there is a great attraction to Jesus. Jesus can still make a lot of sense to people in ways that the church doesn't. Now, I know that's naive, and they'll have to grow up, and they'll realize, blah, blah, blah. But meanwhile, Jesus has a huge attraction for them. They like Jesus, even though it can be very confronting to follow Jesus. And, of course, Christian Smith makes this point in that book that, what's your first name? Susanna referred to, that there can be a kind of a cheap, well, he says that a lot of our youth today are attracted to a kind of a therapeutic deism. It's a belief in God, but it's kind of, he's a nice old God, kind of a Santa Claus God. Makes no great demands on their life. In fact, doesn't really enter into their daily lives at all. But if you ask them, they said they do believe in God. But it's a therapeutic deism, he calls it, that he found rampant in his research, rather than the demanding God, the challenging God, the love your enemies God, do good to those who hate you God, go the extra mile God. We have to bring them to that God. But put them in communion, intimacy with Jesus. So it can't be a little fuzzy, navel-gazing type of me and Jesus thing, because that would be antithetical to our Catholic faith, because it is a radical communal faith. So I don't want to in any way give that impression otherwise. A radically communal faith. But it calls us to conversion. Conversion understood as full and sincere adherence to his person and the decision to walk in his footsteps. In other words, to follow the way. So it's not a kind of a therapeutic niceness that makes us feel good. It is a challenging way. But again, young people can rise to a challenging way in ways that even people like myself get tired trying to rise to such a challenging way. But if you can somehow enable, encourage, foster, pray for, facilitate a conversion to Jesus Christ in young people's lives, then the rest is gravy. Then dogmas and doctrines and sacraments and church and all this kind of stuff, you can fill in all of that. But looking for that relational, that way to enable them to encounter and to come in touch with this kind of personal relationship with Jesus Christ, I don't think we can do good, effective religious education without that. And that's what you pray for, that's what you work for, that's what you try to encourage. And there are ways, I believe, and I'll say this maybe more clearly by the end of the day tomorrow, there are ways, I think, to teach that encourages that. And there are ways to teach that does not encourage that at all. And there's ways to teach that encourages such conversion that is rigorously academic, that is thoroughly, that is a substantive, strong curriculum. And it's possible, with a bit of nuance and tweaking, that this framework might actually be a help toward that end, if it's approached appropriately. It's not an obvious gift to our lives, shall we say, but it has potential. And I believe there is a way to teach and to craft schools and programs and pastoral ministries in our schools that could facilitate, encourage this conversion to Jesus Christ. And always remember, if you're going to teach your young people about it, remember for yourself, it won't all depend entirely on you. There is a reality of the grace of God as well. I think we need a whole new apologetic for our faith. A whole new way of convincing people of it. Apologetics, you remember what it was. You probably had it in high school yourself. I had it in the Dublin High School. And it was Big Din Burke proving that the one true Catholic and Apostolic Church, the four essential marks of the Church, is held by one Church and one Church only, and it is ourselves. And all the rest of them are wrong, defective, led astray, heretics that left, or whatever. And we proved it convincingly, that we were the one true Church. It was such a hegemonic, and it was a manipulative type of thing, and it was also very authoritarian. It was a kind of a coercive thing. But the Church has practiced a very coercive kind of apologetic for many years. And of course, hell was our great trump card. I mean, there was no better thing to threaten people with than hell. I mean, basically, God gave it to Jesus. Jesus gave it to the Church. The Church is giving it to you people. And if you don't believe it, then, hey, there's hell to pay, literally. To take a look at now I'm caricaturing a bit, and I suppose you hadn't heard that lately, but when you look at something like the Catechism of the Council of Trent, it states very clearly, even to question this faith or to wonder about it is already a lack of faith and is a sin. You accept it on the authority of God. Why? Because God revealed it to us. That's why. I'm fascinated with how Benedict is practicing a whole new type of persuasion, a positive orthodoxy. Watch him in England 3 or 4 weeks ago. In the English Parliament, not rushing in with all kinds of caveats and cautions and condemnations, but rather telling people what a wonderful way, what a rich resource this could be for your life. He did the same thing when he was in this country. On that pastoral visit. I guess I read his sermons very carefully. I happened to be in a public media context commenting on them, and so I read them very carefully. But I was fascinated how it was a whole rhetoric of persuasion rather than of coercion. There was no threat, there was no authoritarianism at all to his presentations. It was much more a persuasion. And if we're to get into the business of persuasion, we have to go back and relearn the art of rhetoric. And Aristotle outlined rhetoric as having three aspects, or three ways of crafting the rhetorical, the persuasive: pathos, logos, and ethos. Pathos is the appeal to people's needs, to people's desires. Logos is the appealing to rational coherence in the truth claims of our whole faith. And the ethos is the good fruits it can lead to in daily life. The pathos, where you get into the lives and hearts of people and say, what do you really want? What's your greatest longing? What's your deepest desire? You get into the generative themes. I learned this in Frere years ago, but there's not a hope in hell of teaching kids Catholic faith unless it means something for their lives. It'll go to their heads, maybe, and they'll pass an exam in it. They get a good grade. Now, it will not go to their hearts and won't go to their hands. And the faith, remember, love the Lord your God with all your mind, with all your heart, with all your strength, the whole person. So it's a whole faith. And for it to go only to heads is not enough. It has to go to hearts and hands as well, the commitments by which people live. But I think the way into that, and to that kind of teaching, and we'll say more about this, is to appeal to people, to their needs, to their desires. It was interesting to watch Benedict. I was watching him, as I said, I was anchoring some commentary on it for a media outlet at Dunwoody, when he was saying to young people, do you want to be truly free? Yeah. Do you want to be truly happy? Yeah. Do you want to be a person of great integrity? Yeah. Well, follow Jesus Christ. I don't do a German accent very well, but it was this tremendous appeal. What do you want out of life? What do you really long for? What kind of a person would you love to be? What kind of a life do you want to live? Oh my God, there's no better way. There's no better. Imagine if I ever would get on with living the way that Jesus of Nazareth modeled. What an extraordinary life I would live. What an extraordinary person I would be. I mean, I would be the most loving, the most faithful, the most hopeful, the most compassionate, the most inclusive, the most merciful, the most integral, the most, you name it, imaginable. What an extraordinary way to live your life. This is an amazing truth to our lives, this faith. But to dip into young people's lives and hearts and desires, that this is what it's all about, really. On the Logos, I do think we can mount a rational coherence. In other words, a persuasive argument for the truth claims. And it should be a whole Catholic faith. And I'll come back to that in the morning. That, again, is where the framework could be a help if we, I think, approach it appropriately. But there is a great rational coherence to our faith. Nothing is ever true because the Church said so. Nothing. It's always true for a better reason, which is why the Church says so. But enabling people to come to see for themselves and to be persuaded and to know the rationale for it, I think we're still capable of that. I really do. Rather than say, well, the Church teaches. Well, that won't cut the mustard. Not with this generation. Maybe it did with mine. But it simply won't. And then the ethos is the kind of good fruits that it can lead to. The good fruits it leads to in the lives of other people. The good fruits it leads to in daily life. For example, it can be a true way to happiness. You know, those Beatitudes, we can say, we typically translate them as blessed are, but in fact, makarios, the Greek word there, means happy. That to hunger and thirst from justice is an extraordinary means to happiness in life. To hunger and thirst with compassion for other people, especially people in need, can be extraordinary fulfillment and happiness, real happiness. Not the occasional high or the kind of drugged out moment or something, but extraordinary happiness. It has an amazing potential for young people's lives, but I'm not sure that this is how we present it or this is how we craft our curricula. I think we're not only to teach Jesus and teach what Jesus taught, but I think we're to imitate him as well. Now, this is where I'm on very thin ice. And I wouldn't blame you if you said this fellow is pushing his luck. It's certainly a bit naive in our time and place to say that we have to educate like Jesus. But, and of course that's true. I mean, he didn't have PowerPoint. He didn't, stood up on the side of a mountain, shouting at people because he didn't have amplification and all the rest of it. And yet, we should at least be consistent with the approach that we can recognize in his public ministry. And I think it's an untapped resource, and I think if De La Salle was here, he would be rooting and saying exactly that lovely text that Ernest read for us, the mind that is in us should be the mind of Jesus Christ. And I would say the approach to pedagogy and to religious education, evangelization, catechesis that should be in us would at least imitate, you can't duplicate, but at least would be inspired by and faithful to the style that he had of going about it. And the General Directory for Catechesis says the same thing. The catechists are to imitate the pedagogy of Christ, to embrace Jesus' approach as the best model for communication of the faith. So the question then becomes, what was his method? He's named as teacher, and his ministry is named as teaching at least 150 times in the four Gospels. So it was obviously who he was. I mean, he's called the Son of God 5 times, and we've written libraries of books about that, and rightly so. But teacher was his most common appellation and designation and modus operandi, to teach. He was a teacher. Now, my question to you, from your own sense of it, and all the gospel stories you've known, have taught and read and been inspired by over the years, how would you describe the pedagogy of Jesus of Nazareth? Take your pen and paper again, if you would. What do you think? How do you think he went about it? As an educator, how did he function?